You know, it wasn't all that long ago that I would have called the modern flood of new survival horror titles we've all been blessed by a pipe dream. Something that sure would be nice, but realistically was never actually going to happen. Well, it's no understatement that I was completely wrong on that, and if you've even glanced at my channel in the last few years, you'll know we're actually living through a bit of a renaissance for the genre, which is incredible, but it does bring up a question. Outside of these new indie projects, is it possible to get even closer to that first experience walking through the dimly lit hallways of the Spencer Mansion, or those initial steps into the main entrance of the RPD? And interestingly, the answer is yeah, it's actually pretty easy. Just get a group of devoutly dedicated fans together and starve them of the content that they desire for so long that they resort to just making it themselves. Today we're taking yet another look at the genuinely incredible world of Resident Evil mods and fan games, and believe me when I say that I've cultivated some of the coolest RE-related content the collective scene has to offer. So strap in and prepare for some of the wildest, most unique, and strangest Resident Evil projects you could have ever imagined. What's up, guys? I'm Jared, and this is Avalanche Reviews. I think it's actually fitting that we start this video off with something I didn't really believe would ever happen. Ever since the release of Resident Evil 2's 2019 remake, most of the people that I've talked to had a single question on their minds. How long do you think it's gonna be before someone mods some traditional survival horror fixed camera angles into this game? And I'll admit, my reaction was always, let's say, cautiously pessimistic at best. I mean, everything in the game was designed and balanced around the player only having access to a third-person over-the-shoulder perspective. I mean, the combat, how movement works, the physics, enemy AI, and attack ranges, that's a pretty staggering amount of foundational mechanics to be messing around with. Well, modder Alphas Omega took that as a bit of a personal challenge, and in 2024 released the classic fixed camera mod, which does exactly what its name would imply. Gets rid of RE2R's third-person, over-the-shoulder perspective and replaces it with a series of franchise-appropriate fixed camera angles. Oh, and because you can't have one without the other, it also supplements the game's original control scheme with tank controls. Effectively, this guy took the already incredible RE2 remake and made it even better by turning it into a traditional survival horror game, something that I think deserves some serious praise. Now, before we jump into the meat of this mod, it's probably a good idea to talk about the install process because that's what had me the most worried. Taking a look at the guide on the Nexus Mods page can be a little daunting at a glance to be sure, but honestly, I was surprised at how simplistic it ended up being. All I had to do was grab something called Script Core, the familiar RE framework, and the mod itself. After I gathered all three ingredients, it was a simple matter of dragging and dropping all three into my RE2 install folder in a specific order. It was a lot less involved than I had initially expected, and when I started the game up, the RE framework window gave me easy access to all of the mod's options if I wanted to tweak them. In terms of PC game mod installs, this is probably one of the least challenging I've come across outside of Stalker 2. Now, getting into how RE2 Remake actually works as a classic fixed camera survival horror game, it can be a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, in terms of functionality, it's nearly perfect. The camera angles look slick and they work like you would expect from any of the classic entries in the series. There were a few cases of camera angle change spots being a little too close to each other, which would make it kind of easy to cycle through like 3 angles, only taking 2 steps. But overall, things just sort of work. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are going to wonder how the game's third-person shooting works without the intended perspective, and once again, I have to say I'm really impressed. Admittedly, this was the aspect of a fixed camera system that made me so skeptical of this kind of a mod ever being produced. I just flat out couldn't see the shooting in RE2R making any sense outside of the intended over-the-shoulder camera. And to be honest, what Alphas Omega has done here to deal with that problem is almost more interesting than the whole fixed camera thing itself. There were a few different components working here, but essentially they implemented a sort of soft lock-on feature. Aiming your gun will auto-target the nearest enemy, but any adjustments with the right analog stick will move your laser reticle to hotspots on the enemy. If you end up wanting to take a bit of control for yourself, you can continue moving the stick past the auto-aim threshold, which allows you to do just that. And it all works, like, bafflingly well given the circumstances. In fact, I found just aiming at enemies and shooting them as if I was playing the OG Resident Evil 2 to be the most seamless and easy aspect tied to this mod. However, if you find that this doesn't work so well for you, there's an option to activate the normal RE2R camera when you hit the shoulder button, and honestly, this works a lot better than I would have imagined as well. I mean, aiming in the base game was already great feeling, but now you've got the best of both worlds: atmospheric fixed camera angles and accurate location-based aiming in third person. On top of that, if you want, you can activate an option that locks your character in place while aiming, just like it would in the classic games. They really gave you a lot of tweaks to make with the combat, and I appreciate that like you wouldn't believe. Like I already said though, as a whole, this mod is a mixed bag. Now, the camera and aiming systems are amazing, but actually moving around with tank controls in this mod, it's not the most organic thing I've ever done before. Now, to be totally fair, I get the feeling that this was the absolute best that was possible given the way the original game works. That vanilla movement system in RE2R was just never meant to function the way that it needs to in order for these new camera angles to operate properly. And I think my biggest issue with this modified system is that the animations make it sort of hard for me to read where I'm facing at a glance. In your average tank controls driven game, hitting left or right is going to rotate your character in a way that points their chest and their toes in the desired direction, so you're always going to know when to let that direction go. But in RE2 Remake proper, hitting those directions doesn't rotate a character but actually moves them to the left or the right. Using this mod, D-pad presses still play the animation of your character moving that way, so while I'm actually pivoting Leon here, the animation looks like he's strafing. And when he does move, his feet and his chest are pointing in wildly different directions. Now, if you wait long enough for this animation to play out, it will eventually show them actually rotating the right way, but in a normal session of just using tank controls while playing the game, this isn't very easy to do. Because of this seemingly small issue, I had a hell of a time actually controlling Leon and Claire. It sort of felt like I was some kind of a novice at tank controls. I was running into walls and misjudging turns non-stop. It just didn't feel right, and no matter how long I played, I couldn't get to a point where I was mindlessly controlling my character. Adding to my troubles moving around was the mod's quick turn mechanic. Now, activating it works just like you'd normally expect with an early RE game, but if you hit the up direction to move forward on your D-pad too early, your character will just do another quick turn. I found that I needed to let the animation completely play out before being able to move in the opposite direction, which is definitely doable, but honestly by that point I probably just could have turned them manually anyways. I don't want to sound like I'm getting too negative here. I mean, what this person's done with RE2 Remake is damn near a miracle, and a lot of it does work really well. But I just don't feel like it works well enough to replace the way the game was originally intended to be played. And believe me, I don't want to be the one saying that. You guys know how big of a stuck-in-my-ways old survival horror fanboy I am. This should be heaven for me, and, you know, in a lot of ways it is. The fixed camera angles are great, and I love the nostalgia of seeing such a good-looking AAA project running with this kind of a system. But even I can admit that it just doesn't feel as tight as it should. And to a lesser extent, but still painful, it hurts me to say that a bit of the original's visual atmosphere is lost when viewing it so far outside of how it was meant to be seen. Resident Evil 2 Remake was a game that wonderfully sold its setting with impressively modeled environments and deep, inky black levels. But when you take a bird's eye view of that same location, you just don't get the same effect. I mean, sure, all of the same awesome stuff is still going on, but those events just don't hit as hard with some of the new camera angles. And maybe more importantly, I think a lot of the enemy placement just doesn't jive too well with the new perspective. I had a lot of issues judging how far off zombies were a lot of the time, and even when that wasn't happening, the way that these things move and magnetize to you just doesn't work quite so well with tank controls and the more zoomed out camera. I guess when it all comes down to it, this was a wonderful tool to mess around with and a great look at what could have been, but when it comes to actually playing and enjoying Resident Evil 2 Remake, this is gonna sound crazy, but I think I may actually prefer its original over-the-shoulder perspective. The way that I judged this in my head was by asking if this new fixed camera system worked smoothly enough that it could actually replace the vanilla form of the game for a person who had never played RE2R. And honestly, I don't think that I can say it does. Now, if you've beaten this game over and over and over again like I have, it really is a wonderful way to see it from a different perspective, and it makes for an incredible replay. I just don't feel like this game had enough wiggle room in its mechanics to allow for something like this to be seamlessly stuffed into the same box. Regardless though, I had a great time seeing what a truly accurate RE2 remake could have played like, and since I'm sure all of you have already beaten the game anyways, I really can't think of a reason why you shouldn't try it out as well. The first-person fan remake of RE1 developed by Pero Autonomo was a pretty big deal for a brief little snippet of time. I remember at one point my YouTube feed and my stream chat was awash with people playing and recommending it, and to be totally honest, I was a little skeptical. I mean, I've lived long enough to see Resident Evil games get quote-unquote remade in all kinds of engines. Let's just say I've seen about 1 million projects like this, which always leave me disappointed. And starting up the aptly titled Biohazard project, I wasn't exactly throwing water on that initial negative bias. Before you even get to the game itself, you're almost blasted in the face with the look and feel of a very amateur project. But when you pick the one available character and get the intro started, the ambition and dedication, it comes into much clearer focus. At first, you're met with a remake of RE1's intro, only playing out from the POV of the STARS Bravo team. It's actually kind of impressive and a little adorable. I mean, no, it's not the most visually attractive thing, but I imagine it takes a hell of a lot of effort to get something like this running from the ground up. After that plays out, you're left to run for cover inside the Spencer mansion. And once the misplaced letterboxes get out of the way, you can view this iconic location from an all-new and really cool perspective, which I would say is the main attraction for this particular title. It's just a very cool feeling for lifelong fans of this game to be able to see all of these eerie rooms and hallways rendered in full 3D and in a way that stays surprisingly true to the original art that inspired it. Heading upstairs into the overlook above the dining room, we catch a glimpse of Ken Sullivan being chased by a zombie, so we head down to assist and we get yet another faithful and cute recreation of a famous RE1 cutscene, only with a baffling additional sound effect. From here we get our hands on Kenneth's sidearm, but since there's no aiming reticle and the fire rate is about as slow as the actual game being remade, it's not the big addition to the arsenal that you might expect. What I'm trying to say is that I didn't find the shooting to be too satisfying, but for a project that only exists because one person wanted to mess around with Unity, I'd say it works okay enough. Surprisingly, I actually found the knife to be the most fun to use because it requires just the right amount of spacing for a successful hit that doesn't also result in you taking damage. And you know, for a while I was genuinely surprised at how much of RE1 is in here, but then I picked up an item and got a crash. So I restarted and sure enough the game crashed again after picking up an item. After 2 further crashes, I figured this had something to do with your inventory or something like that, because it would only ever happen after I grabbed my 5th or 6th item. So at that point, this FPS fan game was essentially dead in the water for me, which means I'll probably never know just how much of RE1's main story is playable, but I'd say that's perfectly fine because we've got another, much better entry to cover here. Well, hey there friends and potential lovers. We're going to take a slight break from the action to talk about this video's sponsor. I'm joking, I swear, don't skip ahead. I'm not about to recommend you guys download a VPN, you have my word. This YouTube channel is able to continue pumping out what you could charitably describe as content thanks to a collection of incredible supporters. Both my YouTube members and my patrons not only keep this machine running, but more importantly, they allow me the freedom to cover the games and the topics that I'm passionate about. So every time you see an upload from me that isn't a 15-minute half-hearted rant about whatever dumb shit's trending on Twitter at the moment, you can thank the fine people that are currently scrolling down your screen. Now, if you'd like to join that coalition of absolute survival horror patriots, I'll have links to my Patreon in the description, or you could click that join button below the video. I appreciate you guys taking a bit of time out of your day to stop by, so I'm not going to waste any more of it on self-promotion. Thanks so much to all of my supporters and really anyone who watched this little section. Let's get back into the mods and fan games. The Biohazard 2 first-person fan game is made by the same guy who released the first one. Big surprise there, and right from the start I could tell that this is where their talents were really focused on. Sort of mirroring the PS1 era jump from RE1 to 2, the amount of polish and effort to be found in the Biohazard 2 project is very obvious, even to the most novice eye. Once again, we start out with an amazingly faithful recreation of a Resident Evil intro cinematic, and if the first one was impressive, this one's just flat out mind-blowing. RE2's entire introduction FMV's been recreated in full 3D here, and it runs with the audio from the original, which works a lot better than I would have thought. On top of that, there are these really cool scenes where we're given an extra viewpoint, like when the first zombie gets knocked out of a window, or when Leon makes his way through the alley where he first meets Claire. It makes for a great little revamped intro scene, and I couldn't love it anymore if I tried. And just like the original, after that you're thrown unceremoniously into the middle of the Raccoon City T-Virus outbreak, which shows off that once again the real enjoyment to be found in playing this fan game is the ability to get this full 3D up-close look at a series of locations that you've no doubt formed a lot of nostalgic memories with. It's sort of insane how well this single developer project skirts the line between faithfully recreating the areas from the original game and making them feel sort of brand new. I mean, all of the recognizable RE2 stuff is still going to be there, but it makes for this supremely surreal feeling being able to turn your head and see parts of Raccoon City that used to be just outside of your view before. Like being able to look down from this walkway into the alley below, or seeing some of the destruction in the road up ahead instead of needing to physically be on that screen to view it. Classic Resident Evil did an incredible job of building a fairly cohesive game world in our heads using what were essentially a series of JPEG images. But getting to seamlessly move through this city and finally see it as a single realized location is honestly pretty insane. Outside of the visual stuff though, the game's controls and combat have been tweaked to a degree that I would call bordering on perfection. You no longer have to hold shift to run because you're basically always running, and direction changes are handled in a way that sort of feels like the remake of Resident Evil 2, where it's a sort of fluid feeling system, but you still have to account for the real life physics of completely changing your orientation while moving forward at a full sprint. And the shooting, oh man, this feels so much better. Now you still don't have an aiming reticle, but I'd say that's fine because you can fire noticeably faster, and aiming for headshots will pop a zombie's noggin with just 2 hits. It's actually a kind of genius middle ground between precise FPS gunplay and survival horror resource management. Because without a proper aiming reticle, the zombie's swaying nature and your own unreliable ability to imagine where the center of your screen is from moment to moment makes successful shots far from a guarantee. So you're still going to need to conserve ammo, even though you can now technically take down enemies more efficiently than you ever could in the original, which is a lesson I learned the hard way as I ended up running out of ammo after coming across Mr. X and died to a zombie bite. Rewinding back a little bit though, once we make it inside of the RPD, we can follow the typical order of affairs, and including in-engine cutscenes, I was flabbergasted with how much of RE2 is playable here. Like I said before, I did die a portion of the way through the RPD, but I'll say this fan game was showing no signs of stopping anytime soon while I was getting there. It was honestly really cool to see all of the items exactly where I remember them, and they even put in some of the puzzles from the original. Now on the negative end, this game doesn't have the extra ammo and herb pickups included in the North American release of RE2, but I mean, I wouldn't exactly call a Resident Evil fan game with stiff resource management a technical downside. Personally, I'm stoked as hell to pick this thing back up and see just how far I can make it into Resident Evil 2's events, because if this guy's just putting the entire game in here, I'm gonna lose my damn mind. You know, if you asked me to assume how a follow-up to the first Biohazard FPS project would go based solely on my experience with that initial offering, I would certainly aim far south of what Part 2 has provided. I mean, the environments are way more detailed, the gameplay has been almost perfected, and there's extra geometry to all the 3D models. Quite literally everything in this release is an upgrade on what was included in its predecessor, and outside of that, it's just a really fun playthrough. Shooting zombies, dodging their grabs, and navigating the halls and exterior stairways of the RPD feels kind of magical, and the fact that so much of the original game is playable makes this an absolute must-try for anyone watching this video right now. To be honest with you, I'm actually failing to think of the words to accurately describe how cool it is playing something this well executed and so masterfully polished in the realm of a fan-made first-person remake. So if you're hearing these words and you have even the slightest fond memory of playing RE2 on whatever your home console of choice was, stop what you're doing and head over to the project's itch.io page, because this is one of the coolest things I've come across in a very long time. Since I couldn't exactly get anywhere in the first one and it wasn't that great anyways, I'll go ahead and say you could probably skip it, but definitely make sure you play its follow-up. There are truly very few things in this life as satisfying as splitting a zombie's head straight down the middle with a firearm, so make sure you don't miss your chance to experience it.
What are you doing?
Go get it!
In my last video on Resident Evil mods, I talked about Kendo's Cut by Res Evil Nemesis 30, a pure, crystalline dose of crazy disguised as an RE2 mod, which was honestly an experience I think I'll never forget. And it seemed like a decent chunk of the RE fandom felt the same way, because not too long after that release, we got Kendo's Cut Uncut, a follow-up that makes the original's insanity level seem quaint by comparison. This time, instead of Leon's A scenario, we get to play through Claire B, and once again, it's a fairly standard playthrough up to the RPD, which you should really savor that normality because they're about to get weird.
Hold on. I don't have a clue. Sorry about that, baby. But don't you?
It's like your normal, average, everyday Resident Evil 2, but viewed through the lens of a paranoid schizophrenic. Shenanigans can include, but are not limited to, quantum zombie Kendos floating around like SH4 ghosts, Code Veronica Claire teaming up with RE2's Gator to head back in time, Kendo becoming the president of both America and Russia, Claire getting her ponytail blown off, whatever's happening here, a romantic moment with a one-armed Leon leading to Annette throwing herself into molten steel, Claire merging with RE 1.5's Elsa to form Clairza, of course, Steve becoming so annoyingly Canadian that the game produces a coding error to get rid of him, and Kendo becoming the protector of the timeline while wielding a rocket-firing shotgun called Thor's Hammer. So yeah, things in this mod can get a little wild. Outside of the wackiness though, this thing plays out like a really cool RE2 randomizer, which is a concept I used to not get down with so much. I mean, when I do sit down to a game of Resident Evil 2, most of the fun is playing through it the same way over and over again. Which I know sounds dumb as hell when you say it out loud, but I'm positive if you guys sit and think for a bit, you'll have your own version of that. You know what I mean, a game that you often boot up just to get transported back to that day you first played it. Regardless of that though, now that I've tried a few arranged modes and randomizers in the course of choosing games for this video, I gotta say the idea is really starting to grow on me. You know, of course it helps that Uncut is so balls out crazy. I mean, sure it is nice to find the heart key in a different spot for a playthrough, but I'd argue knowing something like whatever this is around the corner is a little bit more of a motivator. In regards to difficulty, and I know this is gonna sound weak as all hell, but I feel like the first Kendo's Cut was a little too tough near the end of the game. It certainly was doable, but it felt a little more cheap than it did challenging. Uncut by comparison is a much lighter endeavor. And sure, you could argue that RE games should have a good amount of bite to them, but I'd say with a mod like this, the appeal is getting to see what insanity waits for you around every corner. And you know, in that sense, maybe a not quite so punishing experience would lead to more people sticking with it till the end. Which I recommend you do, by the way, because there was never a single solitary moment during this playthrough that I could say I truly knew what the hell was going to happen next. I mean, I was coming across quantum weapons that sounded like toy laser guns, exploring locations from previous RE games. Zombie Marvin was jumping out of a locker to give me a side pack, and at one point Clairza used her ponytail as a propeller to engage in mid-air combat with quantum kendos. This mod truly took me on a roller coaster ride, and it was an exercise in pure insanity for the entire playthrough. There were so many genuine, laugh out loud moments across the 3 hours it took me to beat this thing that there's no way I'm going to be able to fit half of them into this short section. I mean, I haven't even started on the topic of this abomination. The original Kendo's Cut was an absolute blast, and Uncut is just more of that pure lunacy, but better, which I think is about as good of a compliment as I can give. It was an insanely fun and, more importantly, funny playthrough that either had me on the edge of my seat or on the floor laughing for its entire runtime. Oh, and there's a bit near the end that provides some context into the wild events of the first mod and introduces the concept of a cinematic Kendoverse, which should really only sweeten the deal. Let me make this clear. No matter who you are or what you're doing, stop immediately and find a way to play this mod. All it needs is an install of RE2 Source Next and the classic Rebirth.dll, which should be easy enough to get your hands on nowadays. But honestly, even if it weren't, even if it required putting yourself in real-world danger, I would still say it's worth it. Kendo's Cut Uncut is one of the absolute best examples of how great a video game mod can be, and with that in mind, I give it 10 eye patch Kendos out of 10.
Hello. Was it you who rang the bell of awakening?
Round about 5 years ago, I talked about Resident Evil's infamous Game Boy Color adaptation, an attempt by HotGen Studios at porting the RE1 experience to Nintendo's popular handheld. The TLDR there is that Capcom let a British developer take a crack at a GBC port of Resident Evil 1, but as you might expect, the team ran into a series of troubles shrinking a sort of PS1 game down to a 2D platform orders of magnitude less powerful. After a number of delays, Capcom sadly lost faith in the production and scrapped it, opting instead to go with M4's Resident Evil Gaiden. And while it does make sense from a business perspective to go with a game made from the ground up for the intended platform, I think we really missed out on something special. Now luckily, we do have access to 2 different builds of that port, one of them sitting at about 90% complete, so we have at least an idea of what could have been. But if you're like me and you want something a little more tangible, there's the Game Boy Color conversion mod by Lazy Boy, and it might be one of the most interesting RE mods I've ever come across. What we have here is a full conversion that makes the Resident Evil that we all know and love look and sound something like a Game Boy Color title, which it does impressively well. Before we get into the game though, the install process is about as easy as it gets, with the only hang-up being that it requires an additional mod, Classic Rebirth, to be installed in order to work. To be totally honest though, if you're playing RE1 on PC, you should be using CR anyway, so I wouldn't call that a downside. Once you have the conversion downloaded, it's a simple matter of just dragging the compressed contents over to your RE1 install folder, checking retro mode and disabling texture filtering in the Classic Rebirth config screen, and selecting the mod from the drop-down list. Oh, and definitely make sure to also download the mod's separate FMV pack to get a similar GBC conversion for the game's cutscenes. Trust me, it is well worth it. After that, you're good to go. All that's left is to enjoy one of the best games ever made, but with a new, shiny, 8-bit handheld makeover. And I really can't overstate how cool this is. The pre-rendered backdrops have all been converted into something you might conceivably see running on a Game Boy Color, and the 3D stuff uses textures that really sells the idea that these things are actually just 2D flat objects. Then of course there's the 8-bit conversion for all the sound work, which is so damn awesome when you hear it in action. Sadly, all of the game's, I guess you could call it quirky voice dialogue, has been removed to keep with the theoretical limitations of the platform being emulated, which I'm 100% okay with, but all of this stuff just makes for one of the most fun playthroughs I've had of this game since that first time putting it in my PS1 as a 13-year-old. I mean, when I booted this thing up, I was just supposed to grab a bit of footage to make this section of the video, but I ended up playing all the way to the end, twice. And then once on stream. So fucking cool. Wait for it. Yes. Yes, dude. It's so sick. I just kept wanting to see how each new location would look with the 8-bit paint job, or how they would handle the next FMV. And the good news is I can personally confirm that this mod is applied to the entire game. Every single bit of RE1 has been pushed through the filter of late 90s handheld technology, which is a lot more than the actual GBC version of the game was supposed to do. It was a genuine and honest blast running through the game and pretending I was seeing all of this in between passing streetlights through the non-backlit screen of a Game Boy Color on some family vacation as a kid. And you guys know damn well that tech dork in me couldn't stop marveling at how well the texture work and shading made 3D models look like flat 2D sprites. There are a few less than stellar conversions, like the Hellhounds, Plant 42, Neptune, and Hunters looking more three-dimensional, but Chris, Jill, and all of the zombies seem to have taken their look straight from the actual prototype build of the port and absolutely nail the intended effect. Sort of interestingly, the only time that I really noticed the 8-bit illusion being broken was when there were lighting effects being cast onto a character, which revealed the geometry and depth of their models. Of course, that's nowhere near a point against the conversion or anything, it's just more interesting than anything. You know, to be totally honest with you, I'm just extending this script a bit so I can justify putting just a little more footage of the mod on screen for you guys to watch. I can't be more serious when I say that your next playthrough of Resident Evil 1 needs to be using the Game Boy Color conversion. It's an absolute marvel to experience, and novel enough to take even the most familiar parts of the game and give them a fresh enough, almost brand new sort of feeling. And as an added bonus, we get the uncensored FMV of Kenneth's 8-bit decapitated head falling to the floor, which you just really can't beat. When you start to consider all of the random possibilities that you might have with a Resident Evil fan game, I'm gonna assume that the beat-em-up genre isn't the first or even the 25th thing that pops into your head. Which is exactly why I was really intrigued by the Crisis Evil games, a series of fan-made projects running in the Beats of Rage engine, something you could definitely call the RPG Maker or Mugen of the DIY beat-em-up scene. It's an awesome little utility that's resulted in some of the most interesting homebrew I've ever messed around with. And really, BOR games could easily fill its own dedicated long-form video, but for the moment, that's not what we're here for. Crisis Evil is a series of brawlers, and to be honest, I've seen them credited to Hardim and Dimitri, but I've seen other credits elsewhere, so apologies if that's not correct. When I initially did a bit of research into these fan games, the first and the third ones seemed like the obvious choices. I mean, big, bright, colorful sprites, lots of animations, most of them ripped from MVC2. Chef's kiss, no comment, I'm already sold. But when I laid my eyes on part 2, I knew that was the one I really wanted to put some time into. And if you're looking at the screen right now, hopefully you can already tell why. Crisis Evil 2 is a little like Donkey Kong Country on the SNES in the sense that its sprites are actually just 2D renders of Resident Evil's original 3D assets, which makes for a very, really awesomely cool look in motion. So obviously, it was the visuals that got my foot in the door, but after starting up a game, the ingenuity and the effort, that's what really wowed me. Sticking with the source material, you've got two campaigns on hand, Leon and Claire, and like the actual RE2 on PS1, my instinct was to go with Leon first. I have no idea why I do it, I always do. When I started the game, I was met with his scenario's full intro FMV, along with what I would call a surprisingly faithful progression through the actual events of the game. And we're not exactly talking a compressed Cliff Notes version either. Now, I didn't make it all the way through his story because I wanted to try out Claire in the multiplayer, but when I stopped recording, I was sitting at about 2.5 hours of playtime. As far as I can tell, every major story beat and location is included in some sort of way, and the lengths that these people went to in order to get this stuff all to fit into a 2D brawler is mind-blowing. They even require you to collect key items and backtrack in order to progress sometimes. Just a wild level of dedication for a project that no one would have expected to stay true to the source material anyways. I do have to admit though, when it comes to the actual moment-to-moment gameplay, at least at the start I was feeling less than enthusiastic. Moving around feels okay enough, with a fairly speedy walking pace and a run that you can activate by double tapping left or right. A feature that I always love seeing in these types of games. It's sort of like a double jump in a Metroidvania, I need it to be there. The rest of the face buttons are basically all used for attacks. There's the knife button, which is your standard attack, a shoulder barge, which is way more handy than you might think, a button that pulls out your gun if you have ammo, and one dedicated to stomping on grounded enemies and putting down items like ammo or special weapons. Now, like I said, I didn't have the best experience out of the box, and in my defense, the game doesn't go out of its way to explain itself, so I imagine a lot of people may have had the same issue. As I continued to play though, struggling and getting frustrated with mechanics that felt more than a little cheap, I started to figure out what this game was really working with, and I sort of fell in love with it. Alright, so the worst offender on my list of initial grievances that were eventually proved wrong was that even on the first screen, zombies could basically stun lock you to death with general ease. At this point, it seemed like taking a single hit almost guaranteed that I'd be stuck in a cycle of eating damage till I lost a life and got to reset my position. But then I discovered that doing a shoulder barge would actually break an enemy grab and allow me to either continue my combo or get a little distance on the enemy. And you know, this sort of revolutionized the game for me. After figuring that out, I was kicking ass and taking names, no issues. Which is when I noticed this next point. Enemies in this game can take an absolute shit ton of damage. So instead of planting your feet and trading blows, it's often a better idea to get your hits in at a reasonable distance and then move around to bait the enemy to come to you so you could do it all over again. Which, you know what, actually, hold on. Let me put on my dork-ass video essayist hat. I found this feature to be a staggeringly deep inclusion, which mirrors Resident Evil's own mechanical reliance on spacing and timing. Realizing this, I paused the interactive experience on my screen and I noticed a slight chill on my face. The kind of chill that could only come from a single, lonely tear running down my cheek. My God, I thought, these developers have looked straight into my soul. And it looked back. After that little roadblock was cleared though, I struggled hitting zombies on the ground and the crows or the roaches in the air. In the case of the former, you do have the dedicated stomp, but this move has a really short range and the zombies on the ground are even more grab happy than their walking counterparts. So that scenario always seemed to result in me taking what felt like cheap damage. Then I realized that I could double tap up or down to get high or low knife strikes, which solved that issue handily. And on an even cooler note, the low stabs caused a bit of stagger on standing bad guys. After learning these lessons, I was having a nearly non-stop blast. Walking through familiar RE2 environments, fist-fighting BOWs, watching cutscenes as if I were playing the legit game, it was fun as all hell. For those first 20 or so minutes, things felt very bland and sort of static as I would approach every single combat scenario with the standard knife swipe and maybe a dash attack. But after I figured out that every single offensive button has a place in just about every scenario, the gameplay experience became miles more dynamic and way more engaging. All of your combat options aren't going to combo into each other like a fighting game, but they synergize nicely, and once you start using all of them together, you'll find a really entertaining brawler here. But at the risk of invalidating all of that, during Leon's campaign, you get to take control of Ada for a fairly good chunk of time, and I sort of feel like this section is where I had the most fun. Basically, everything I just described is still a factor here, but there are two main differences. A, the always classy Mrs. Wong has infinite ammo for her pistol, and B, the playfield has been shortened vertically, which in my opinion puts the full potential of this game's combat on display much better than Leon's section does. These two additional factors leads to a nice focus on mobility, as the lessened vertical real estate means enemies are always a little closer to you than they were before, and Ada's gun isn't exactly a powerhouse of a sidearm. So moving around, getting in a few gunshots or knife strikes, and then delivering a hard knockdown to start the process over again feels a little more satisfying, and you end up having to do it a little more often. If you ask me, it's the perfect combination of all of its mechanical elements just banging on all cylinders. I mean, truly the most enjoyable section and an already really fun game. I do, however, have a few complaints that persisted even after I learned how to play the game and got to experience Ada's kick-ass gun-based combat. To be fair, some of them are the kinds of issues that are common to retro beat-em-up games and not really all that big of a deal. Stuff like a reliance on cheap enemy tactics that keep you locked in a damage cycle until you die, or not being able to hold on to a weapon to save your life. However, a few of my issues cross well over into the realm of really damn annoying. For example, I can forgive not having some sort of a juggle system. I mean, I would love to be able to keep enemies in the air with attacks, but I can live without that. But damn, would it be really, really nice to be able to do some sort of damage to bad guys once they've hit the floor. Now, you do have the downward strike that I talked about before, but that only damages enemies that are crawling around on the floor. Once you've knocked a zombie down with a full combo, you can't hurt them until they go through the fairly long process of getting back up again. Which, feels like something that could have easily been fixed. I also don't understand why both Leon and Claire have this really simplistic 3-hit combo where the same exact animation is used for all 3 strikes. I mean, listen, it would be fairly easy to just accept this as the best that the developers could do, but in some areas you get to play as a variant of Leon that actually has a proper combo. And to add insult to injury, once you make it past the sewer section, he just magically gains this really cool 5-hit chain that would have made the beginning parts of the game way more fun. I do want to be fair, these are comparatively small gripes. They're just stuff that offer a bit of resistance to the wild amount of fun you can have with the game, but they definitely don't overpower it. That being said, this next issue I really can't say that for. After having an awesome time with the single player, I was genuinely stoked to get my wife in the room for a little 2-player action. Which I swear to God is not the sexual innuendo that it sounds like when I say it out loud. You know what? Never mind. I changed my mind. It 100% is that, and I am actually really funny on purpose. Anyways, the point is we started the game, jumped in a Claire scenario, and it was incredibly disappointing. I was able to forgive our characters not having different outfits or colors, although it did cause a bit of confusion the entire time, but far worse than that was the game's difficulty. I did imagine that the challenge would scale up a bit. I mean, we could potentially deliver twice the damage in roughly the same amount of time using 2 characters, but things became so damn hard that a lot of the fun disappeared behind it. Zombies were taking way more time to put down, and when they turned into these red guys, which I'm gonna assume is some kind of a crimson head, it was a nightmare actually killing them. They have way more health, they hit harder, and they grab you more often. All of the problems I talked about before came into way harder focus now that the bad guys were taking 3 times as long to defeat and doing way more damage. Which really sucks because when you play a game like this, the expectation is that multiplayer is where the best experience is to be had. But in this case, it actively makes the game worse to play. On the plus side though, the single player is a whole 5-gallon drum of awesome, and if anything warrants a playthrough just to see a beat 'em up recreate nearly every moment from RE2. If you can't tell already, Resident Evil Survive is another open Beats of Rage beat 'em up. Created by Chris Monville, this fan game gets almost everything right in my opinion. I mean, don't get me wrong, I enjoyed the hell out of Crisis Evil 2, but while I was playing it, it sort of felt like there was a theoretical ceiling to the fun I was having, and I knew somebody could push past that. To give a bit of context, I definitely grew up during the golden era of scrolling beat-em-ups. The titles that put the genre on the map, like Streets of Rage and Final Fight, were in nearly constant rotation at my house. So I do have an appreciation for those classics, but for me, personally, these types of games really peaked more towards the tail end of the 90s when more fighting game style mechanics started to make their way in. You know, stuff like being able to juggle enemies in the air, OTG attacks, and a focus on faster, flashier combat. This is the era that I really connected with, and Resident Evil Survive is a damn near perfect distillation of everything that made that the case. When you start the game, you're given a nice little interactive tutorial where you can learn like 90% of Survive's mechanics, which is something that the previous title really would have benefited from. The basic rundown is that you have 5 attack options: a normal combo, a weapon-based attack on button 3, a long-range attack with your sidearm, a more powerful shot that uses an even bigger, therefore cooler gun, and a special attack that drains your HP but delivers a hard knockdown to everything it hits. Your gun attacks work on a meter underneath your life bar that can be refilled with ammo pickups, and this actually plays into what makes the game so damn fast-paced and fun. You're almost always being given healing items and ammo from the environment or downed enemies, which encourages a more balls-to-the-wall approach to combat. Because you can almost always count on getting your resources refilled, you're more likely to use life-draining specials or capping off an awesome combo with your more powerful guns. It's like the game is constantly rewarding you for playing recklessly, putting your ammo and health in constant flux to extend combos or get in extra damage. And adding on top of this is what I guess you could call the game's physics. The BOWs that you're going to come up against can take a ton of damage before getting knocked down, so you have a few options that'll launch them into the air, either for a sick-ass air juggle or just so you can get a little breathing room. Once they do end up airborne, they can easily be kept that way with well-timed attacks and good mobility. And even once they hit the ground, you still have a fraction of a second where they can still be damaged or even launched up into the air again. This is where the fighting game influence starts showing its head as I start theory crafting exactly which attacks can be performed in a certain step in a combo to ensure that I can keep as many enemies as possible stuck in an endless barrage of attacks. My favorite strategy was to string together 3 or so dash attacks, making sure to catch them just as they hit the floor, then comboing into a special which would relaunch them and ending with a more powerful gun attack at just the right time so they fall right into it. It's a pretty special feeling hitting like 10 bad guys with a massive combo and then knocking them up into the air and keeping them that way for what feels like minutes. And it definitely helps that the game has so many different characters to choose from. Of course, all the mainstays are represented, but you've also got a nice selection of what you could call the less used entries in the RE roster. Surprisingly enough, the only one I didn't enjoy playing with was Wesker. His moves are dope as hell, but a lot of them push him away from enemies, making combos a lot harder to pull off, especially when you're near the edge of the screen, which is like 75% of the playtime. At the end of each level, you can use RE4's Merchant to refill your life and ammo, but since this doesn't cost anything, it sort of feels like it could have been handled automatically in the background instead of making me drag a giant Windows cursor around for a few seconds. I mean, the game has no point economy, and there's never really a situation where you'd want to start a level with less life or ammo, so I'm lost on what the point was here. And I'm very happy to report that one of my biggest complaints with the previous RE brawler is nowhere to be found here. 2-player mode in Resident Evil Survive is an absolute blast, and the frenetic nature of the combat mechanics makes it really easy for you to pull off some cool-ass tandem shit. One of the best feelings in the world was when me and my wife would accidentally end up in a situation where we're playing volleyball with some poor zombie as they bounce from one side of the screen to the other. And the difficulty feels perfectly tuned for the added amount of firepower that multiplayer brings, staying pretty well within that tough-to-reach middle ground of challenging but not frustrating. In terms of the presentation, there's a nice bit of talent on display here. Of course, a big chunk of the sprites are ripped from Jill's inclusion in Marvel vs. Capcom 2, and coming from a guy that mained her, Ruby Heart, and Rogue in that game, I'm supremely appreciative of this. That being said though, there's a good amount of impressive new, or I guess maybe altered assets might be a better word. The Chimeras and Hunters stand out as being particularly well drawn, and while the playable characters can be sort of hit or miss sometimes, almost everyone looks great. I mean, sure, you can tell that everything here has been modified from some other game's sprites, but I mean, that doesn't bother me at all. I feel like it shouldn't bother you either. And hey, shout out to Forrest, just Naruto running across the screen and blowing himself up when you fully drain his HP. A nice little RE1 Remake reference that I can definitely get down with. Really and truly, the only complaint that I have with Survive is that it can be a little short. I mean, it's great seeing these little sprite art recreations of the Spencer Mansion, but progression through these areas is a bit stilted. You're basically going to be sitting on the same screen for an extended period of time while the game dumps hordes of bad guys on you. So the actual size of each level is only a few screens wide, but you're going to be moving through those screens like a slug through molasses. What would be really amazing is if we could somehow combine both this and Crisis Evil 2. Maybe take CE's long runtime and wealth of locations and throw it in a blender with Survive's flashy button-mashing combat. And you know, while we're making a theoretical game here, go ahead and throw in Crisis Evil's pre-rendered 2D sprites while you're at it. You know, these kind of games are what makes doing a video like this so interesting. I mean, you'd be expecting someone to deconstruct Resident Evil and reconfigure it into something that still feels like RE, but sometimes the real fun is in transplanting all of those familiar elements into a gameplay style completely alien to the originals. And I don't know about you, but I would say 2D arcade beat-em-ups are about as far from PS1 era survival horror as a person could ever possibly get. So if you're in the kind of situation where you find yourself looking for something a little wild but also a little recognizable, I'd say you really couldn't go wrong with either of these BOR projects. Because when you really think about it, deep down, I think we've all at some point wanted to see Leon uppercut a zombie into the air only to blast him in half with a shotgun as they fall back to the earth. Because there's no way it's just me thinking that.
A victim to the T-virus. No wounds. Better write this in my diary.
Resident Evil 3.5 Code Madman by Shigaworks might require a bit of a perfunctory explanation. For those of you who are lucky enough to not be so old that the reality of needing a rectal exam is no longer a far-off concept, Resident Evil 4 went through a few different phases during development. The very first time any of us would get a look at what sort of title it was shaping up to be, the game was in a very different form than what would eventually hit store shelves. In fact, a lot like Resident Evil 2, the fourth entry in Capcom's survival horror series reached a not complete, but not exactly incomplete sort of level as a totally different game, only to have its development restarted. Unlike RE2 though, we never actually got our hands on that prototype build. But that didn't stop Shigaworks from studying the gameplay trailer and using Unity plus a few tastefully borrowed assets to create something that might be the closest thing we may ever have to Resident Evil 3.5. Starting up Code Madman, we're dropped into a spooky mansion type of location, which is going to sound crazy, but I would say is a pretty novel and unique location to set a Resident Evil game in. As I walked around, a few things became clear, but chief among them is that this is without a doubt the coolest version of Leon we've ever seen. My guy looks like instead of Special Forces, he got assigned to the 1st Division of the Typo-Negative Brigade. Outside of that though, the coolest thing going on here is the mix of perspectives and the controls used to navigate them. Now I'll admit that it took me a bit of time to acclimate to things, but once I got there, this was one hell of an immersive system. The basic idea is that the camera isn't tied to your character's movement, so you could be looking in one direction but moving in another. However, once you hit the run button, the camera swings around to a more traditional RE4 type of perspective, if not pulled back just a little further. On top of that, and you know I'm gonna love this one, there are sections with a fixed camera and some that'll have the player being followed by the camera on a set track. Honestly, it's an amazing combination of old and new, a best of both worlds sort of scenario. When you hit the aim button, you'll get the type of over-the-shoulder view that an RE4 fan would be looking for, which is nice because that's genuinely a great way to handle third-person shooting. But as you explore, the developer has free reign of how you see the game, and each section of this castle or mansion feels orders of magnitude more atmospheric than any location that the actual RE4 has ever offered, or at least to me it does. I will say though, the aiming is a bit finicky, and the one and only enemy that you come across in the demo can basically dodge every bullet you fire at it like some sort of agent from the Matrix just through the sheer act of its wobbly walk cycle. Most of this little preview of what could have been is spent wandering through a creepy set of quasi-supernatural circumstances, which actually does stay in line with a portion of what the trailers were showing off at the time. Now personally, and I don't think I'm going to surprise anybody here, but I've never liked the idea of taking Resident Evil into the realm of ghosts and possessed dolls. But after walking through a few of these sections, I could see that actually working. Maybe not in a Resident Evil game, but I would play something like this no problem. As you play this thing, you really can't deny how dark and eerie it can be. It's a combination of the sound, controls, camera system, and weird stuff going on around Leon. And all of those elements feel like they were implemented by someone who really understood how to balance each one to better fit the others. I mean, yeah, this person was using the available trailers as inspiration, but it takes a hell of a lot of talent to translate something you've only ever seen into an interactive experience. Honestly, I started Code Madman up specifically to get a similar feeling to what I had with RE 1.5's playable build. That being a small window into the development of a game that never actually came out. But I ended up with something completely different. Instead of getting to play what could have been, I was left wondering why the hell we don't already have a game that controls and feels like this. I'm definitely still more of a grounded horror guy, but honestly, any game coming out that plays and looks like this demo would be incredible in my eyes. Once you get the controls down and figure out that they're built more for slow exploration, overrunning through an area real fast, the demo feels amazing in your hands, and the combination of different perspectives feels incredibly cohesive together. I certainly wouldn't have thought that would be the case before getting to see them in action, but the strange amalgamation of Resident Evil's Code Veronica 2 and 4 makes for a level of style and immersion that might be a little more than the sum of its parts. So please, I'm begging you here, if you have anything to do with making video games, put together a proper survival horror game using this exact assortment of mechanics. Like now.
A fog.
Resident Evil Crossfire is a fan game set in the RE universe created by 3Do in 2016. Now, usually when you hear all of those words in the same sentence, you tend to unconsciously form a bit of a pre-concluded expectation. Because let's face it, the vast majority of Resident Evil fan games are either modifications of existing RE titles or low-effort source engine projects. And I've got some good news for you. Not only is Crossfire neither of those things, but it's also surprisingly impressive. The starting text crawl lets us know that it's set in 1998, presumably after the whole Raccoon City debacle, and concerns a higher-up at Umbrella who managed to get their hands on the T-Virus. In the spirit of making a clean getaway from that heist, this person releases just a bit of the T-Virus in a city called Ashport, which I gotta say is pretty on brand for the franchise. I mean, Umbrella has historically treated viruses that can mutate the human genome like a well-prepared sandwich in a company breakroom fridge, and most of the people who work there are evil enough to want something like that, but not smart enough to not cause a massive zombie outbreak when getting it. At the start of the game, you're given the illusion of choice with two possible characters to play as, but one isn't available, and given the year this thing was initially released, I'd say waiting on more content would be a poor use of your time. But hey, that's perfectly fine because, like I said before, there's a lot more in this fan game than you might initially expect. In terms of gameplay, minus like 2 elements, this is just about as Resident Evil as it gets. It's got inventory management, item boxes, ink ribbon saves, accurate enemy behavior and combat, puzzles, cutscenes, files to read, and proper survival horror backtracking. It basically hits every single franchise nail on the head, which is impressive as hell for a game made by a single person and in an engine I have literally never heard of before. Your main character, Paul, is a member of the UBCS who's made the mistake of riding in a helicopter during the intro of a video game. So obviously that thing has crashed harder than me thinking I can supplement a lack of good sleeping habits by consuming my own weight in caffeine every day. Since they're stuck inside the outbreak zone, he and his CO are now in the business of exploring a zombie-infested city looking for a possible exit. All in all, a solid, if not a little overused setup for an RE game. But hey, old tricks are often the best tricks, and there's a really good reason for that. The city of Ashport feels a bit like a mix of RE3's Raccoon City and the version of the same place that shows up in the first mission of Outbreak File 1. Lots of outdoor areas where you can get an eyeful of a metropolis that was very recently overrun with bloodthirsty zombies, and interior locations that look like the series' common everyday storefront or church just turned into humanity's last stand. Progression, hunting for items, backtracking across the environment, and puzzle solving all feel really accurate to what you'd likely encounter in an early Resident Evil game. It's not exactly something that I'm gonna be able to itemize for you, but you gotta trust me when I say that the vibe of a legit late 90s Capcom survival horror game is well pulled off here in Crossfire. Speaking of which, as you roam around, you'll come across a rogues gallery of series combatants featuring the obvious Walking Dead, Cerberus, and Lickers. Crossing paths with these BOWs and spraying them with the latest, most fashionable lead-based perfume feels about on par with the series tradition as well, with a big focus on spacing and, when possible, avoidance. Which unfortunately leads me to one of the game's worst handled features. As I played Crossfire, I just never got to a point where I stopped struggling with the controls. Now obviously, we're dealing with the preferred tank controls method here, but the game's developer seems to have run into some issues with recreating that very recognizable RE style of the mechanic in his fan game. Now, if anybody knows this, it's me, but people do often complain that this style of control can be very stiff and tough to adapt to, which I of course have always argued against. Except in this case. Moving around just feels sluggish and unresponsive. As I pivoted with the left and right directions though, I think I might have figured out what the problem is, and as usual with this channel, it's a little hard to explain verbally, so here goes a poor attempt at doing it anyways. Essentially, there's an animation of Paul taking steps while he's turning in circles, and the startup time for this to kick in is just a hair too slow. On top of that, this animation makes it a little hard to tell at a glance exactly where his toes are pointed, so you can't really gauge a precise heading just by looking at your character. You're really only able to get a rough idea of where he's pointed while this animation plays out, and these two factors combined makes it really hard to achieve some level of fluidity when controlling the game. Plus, the turn speed while running is dreadfully slow, so you might as well get okay with the idea of stopping a lot to make slight adjustments to where you're headed, because you'll either be doing that or running into a lot of walls. On a similar note, I found the scenery in Crossfire to be relatively sticky. Running past corners or background elements that jet out sharply can get Paul caught up fairly easily, which means you need a level of precision to control this game that it just isn't providing. On the more positive side of things though, these are the only issues that I had, and even with controls that aren't exactly the most user-friendly, you can still find an awesomely familiar and fun survival horror experience here. And since we're on that line of thinking, oftentimes with these fan games, if one element is gonna fall by the wayside, it's gonna be the puzzles. But I gotta say, Crossfire has some dope-ass head-scratchers. These things just feel right for the franchise being emulated here, and outside of that, they required a nice bit of logical thinking. Honestly, this might be the one element in the game that impressed me the most. In terms of its presentation, it's a mixed case of handmade assets and ones that were, let's say, borrowed from other titles in the series. Off the top of my head, I noticed some zombies from RE1R and Outbreak, doors from Code Veronica, and audio files from across the RE-verse, which for a game that's 100% free is 100% fine with me. I will say that in some areas I found that I had to proceed kind of far past the edge of the visible screen in order to trigger the next camera angle, but this seemed to only affect a few sections of the game, namely the church's graveyard. Aside from a few small complaints though, this was a very surprising playthrough. Like I already mentioned, it can be easy to have certain lowered expectations when playing an RE fan game, let alone one that wasn't made as a mod to an existing RE title. But Crossfire delivers an experience that feels wildly authentic to the series, and in a way that still offers a few new ways to see that original style. It being a title released in 2016, it might be on the low-tech side. And on top of that, stuff like the fact that it's never actually going to be finished and its 720p resolution ceiling may be hard to swallow concepts nowadays, but despite all of that, I can't help but recommend you guys head over to GameJolt and check this one out. It's refreshing and competent in ways that you flat out wouldn't expect given the circumstances, but more importantly, it's just fun to play. And hey, who knows, enough videos like this get made and maybe we'll see this guy make a comeback and apply his talents to the growing modern genre revival. Or, maybe he already has. I literally did no research before saying that. I've talked about this a lot in the past, but the survival horror genre is basically just an offshoot of the point-and-click adventure with a different method for controlling your character. And that's a fairly apt point to be making at this specific moment because we're looking at Resident Evil Point and Click by MPH64. Now I'll go ahead and let you guys know up front that this thing is about as close to unfinished as you can get while still having the ability to boot into the game. That being said, I think this on-hold project is just proof that the idea at least can definitely work. As fans of the point-and-click genre may be expecting, you use your mouse to move Leon around Sheena Island, and there are modifiers on the keyboard like hitting Control to have him run or Shift for aiming his weapon. When an object can be interacted with, the cursor will turn into an exclamation point, and I think that's about it. This is a very short slice of what could be possible with a point-and-click interaction system inside of a survival horror game. But like I said, I think there's some real potential here. Well, maybe not here specifically. This game is a broken mess, but the ideas it's messing with appear to be sound. Clicking around the environment to move works surprisingly well, and with just a bit of tweaking, it could be much smoother than what's possible in this title. One of the biggest issues for me was actually being able to interact with things. Getting the cursor to change into that exclamation point is more of an art than a science. And if there's an interactable object on top of something that could be examined, like this ink ribbon on top of a pinball machine, it's essentially a dice roll whether or not you'll pick the item up or look at the thing it's on. Annoyingly, your character model can block the cursor from being able to click on things, and the same goes for zombies. Plus, you need to be pretty close for that exclamation mark to show up, which doesn't feel great in practice. The ability to click on a door from across the room and have Leon just sprint to it and use it once he gets there would have been really nice. In terms of aiming, it could be kinda tough figuring out whether or not your shot's properly lined up, and the zombies' reaction animations basically give them iframes. I think both issues would be really easy to fix, but for the first one, a little laser aiming reticle type of deal would be perfect. As for the zombies being invincible during their pain states, maybe just slow down the gun's fire rate and speed up the zombies' animations. Nice and simple. Using a Resident Evil style inventory with a mouse is pretty odd feeling, but it works for the most part, and just like the gameplay, just sort of seems spiritually right. I'd say the only thing that actually threw me for a loop was that reading files required a few directional inputs from the keyboard when everything else in the inventory only needs the mouse. While running around, I had a hell of a time getting screen transitions to trigger fairly often, which again feels like an easy enough fix. But the real issue was that if you don't complete a very specific set of actions in a very set order, the game is sort of impossible to get through thanks to the way ammo's distributed. I found that if you don't follow that strict order of exploration, you'll come across too many zombies directly in your path, which means you're gonna have to shoot them. And if this happens, you essentially won't have enough ammo to make it to the next item drop. Now, it goes without saying, but this is an incredibly rough take on the concept, but it's an idea that I think can work. And honestly, the Resident Evil 2 and Survivor assets look so damn good at 1280 by 1024 in the Unity engine. It's almost worth playing the game just to see how great it looks. Regardless though, there's just a ton that could be done with this wacky combination of genres if the right person with the right amount of experience were to take a crack at it, so let's hope this will inspire someone to do just that. Alright, so it dawned on me that I talked a pretty healthy amount of shit when covering MPH64's Resident Evil point-and-click game, so I decided to give them a second chance to wow me with another one of their projects, Return to Sheena Island. And I'll be damned if they didn't do just that. I mean, to be fair, this is still a very heavily janky experience, but it's really ambitious and impressive as well. Plus, you know, the bar was already set fairly low.
Don't move.
The game starts out with Ada Wong traveling to the setting of Resident Evil Survivor with the vague intention of bringing down Umbrella. Along the way, she crosses paths with Art Thompson, and that's about all the story there is to talk about here. Which I'll admit is a little disappointing, but for a brief 20-minute affair, not the biggest downside I could imagine. The general form and function, though, is a much more positive subject. Everything you might expect from an RE title can be found here, right down to little stuff like ink ribbon saves and inventory-based item combinations. Progress is handled really well with the expected survival horror style of incremental exploration, and the puzzles included were surprisingly true to that recognizable Resident Evil style. Something I feel like I have said about 35,000 times in this video already. The only enemy type included are your typical zombies, which is perfectly fine for me because they're my favorites anyways. Shooting at these things feels about right for the series, and for the most part, running around them does too. And look, I know this is all pretty baseline stuff for a game like this, and not exactly something to go wild over, but there's a combination of factors to consider here. Obviously, my initial experience with this person's work wasn't exactly the best first impression you could imagine, but more importantly, the game was made from the ground up in Unity versus the approach most projects take, which is just modifying an existing PC port of a Resident Evil game. So for a person who's recreating all of these systems by feel alone, I'd say this is actually a really impressive showing. The overall flow is spot on, and outside of a small bit of instability, things just operate in a way that makes it kind of hard to tell that this thing wasn't just another RE2 mod, at least in terms of functionality. Thanks to this game's bespoke engine, the developer could achieve things that could never be done with most RE mods. For example, we've got this really cool, fully 3D environment, and these sections where the camera will follow the player for short bits. Oh, and there's also the kind of surprisingly good-looking widescreen display. Sticking with that note, Return to Sheena Island is an impressive little visual package. All of the RE2 assets and models look super shard. Super shard. They are super sharding. Let's try that again. All of these RE2 assets and models look super sharp at this high of a resolution, and the blood effects when shooting zombies are great, even if sometimes they stop appearing. But hey, you don't know, maybe the zombies have just run out of blood by that point. And since we have broached the subject, a few other little issues cropped up during my 2 playthroughs. For example, at one point I let a few zombies kill me just to see what it would look like, and when I finally died, I noticed a continue option. So I chose that, and instead of starting over at my last save, Ada's dead, lifeless body was just transported into the save room. Which for all we know might just be some sort of meta real-life mechanic. Like if you died and somebody just took you to the last place you were when you were alive, you'd still be dead. Regardless, I couldn't move, hit start, or access any menus, which was kind of funny, but not as funny as this other time when I fell through the floor of the sewer and ended up somewhere out of bounds. We're not done with this story yet, don't worry. So I restarted the game and loaded my save, which I guess was not a good idea because after I did that, I noticed my inventory icons were all completely different, my gun was no longer visible in my hand, and I couldn't interact with anything without the game locking up. Now the interesting thing was, I would get the same result every single time I loaded that save file, so I guess that thing is just eternally corrupted, which, isn't great, but I was able to get to the end of the game on a second attempt, and even with those bugs in mind, I still had a great time with this one. I imagine it's not very easy recreating a bunch of familiar Resident Evil mechanics and systems all by hand, and I think MPH64 deserves a hell of a lot of credit for doing as well as they did. I mean, throughout my time with Return to Sheena Island, I couldn't shake the feeling that this could totally be an official Capcom release with just a few very minor changes. Progression worked exactly as expected, items were intelligently laid out, making exploration feel especially good, and I was supremely impressed by the puzzles. They weren't the most challenging in the world, but each one required a few different bits of info to solve, and getting those clues required a nice level of engagement with the exploration and backtracking. Honestly, this game punches way above its weight class, not only for how close it's able to get to that Resident Evil feel, but just in terms of delivering a really solid, if a little short, survival horror experience. Well, thanks so much for stopping by, fellow dorks and/or nerds. If you made it to this point in the video, I have to assume you've gotten some kind of value out of it, and if you want to help contribute to more videos just like this, feel free to stop by my support platforms linked down below. On a totally unrelated note, I am once again in the process of cutting weight at the moment, so if there's anyone watching who'd like to join me in beating the fat, lazy gamer stereotype, let's do it. I don't know about you guys, but I'd say it's time for the jacked video game fanatics to rise up and take their rightful place on top of the social hierarchy.